Hi, everybody. Welcome to SPE Live. Welcome back from our earlier morning show if you caught us earlier today. Otherwise, please check us out. So if you are new to SPE Live, catch us on hashtag SPE Live, or you can find us on spe.org. My name is Nils Korgesson-Low. I am your host today, and we are talking Canadian energy innovations, today's show. SPE Live is part made possible by sponsorship from the SPE Foundation. As I said, we are talking about innovations in the Canadian energy industry. So it's been in the recent past possibly unfairly overshadowed by the vast US unconventional oil and gas factory. Now founded on a resilient base of unconventional and heavy oil industry, there's an emergence of a new technology as Canadian operators begin to adopt to a more rational middle in the energy supply spectrum. So innovations in oil and gas operations, CCUS, methane detection, hydrogen, and novel combinations of renewables. That's all what we're going to be talking about today. So a really packed show, a lot of really good topics. So please join in our conversation. Use the social media chat to ask questions and give your comments. So if you want comments and questions about Canadian energy, then please join us in the social media chat. We really want to hear from you all. If you have buddies who want to know more about today's SPE Live, just repost and tag us on social media. So today, joining us, we have a real expert panel on the Canadian energy industry. I'll be asking them questions and talking about the current status of the Canadian heavy oil and unconventionals, the unique Canadian energy industry culture and innovation that is beginning to set Canada apart and giving it a competitive edge. So let's meet our panelists. So joining us today, we have Patrick Miller. Patrick has over 12 years of experience in the Western Canadian energy industry. The majority of his career has been at Talisman Energy Repsol, but recently moved to Petronas Energy Canada. His primary roles have been in technical assurance, reservoir engineering, field development, research, operations, engineering, pipe spool fabrication, and downhole tools. He is an active SPE volunteer, including committee chair for the 2019 SPE Duvernay workshop and the 2020 Canadian Virtual Unconventional Resources Conference that is being held next week. Patrick holds a BSc and an MSc degrees in mechanical engineering. Also on the show today is Marty Lastiwka. Marty is a senior production engineer at Suncor Energy for the last 8 years. Prior to Suncor, he was a senior research engineer at SPE Technologies, helping facilitate use of leading-edge technology in unconventionals, heavy oil, and other challenging environments like deep water offshore and the Arctic environment. Also on the panel today is David Langille, petroleum engineer and Rocky and Gold Area Manager, Alberta, Shell Canada Unconventionals. Dave has 10 plus years of experience in Shell Canada's Upstream business in reservoir engineering, technology, and fluids. Collaboration across the technical commercial spectrum to optimize unconventional development in Canada is what keeps David excited and up all day. His engineering education comes from Arcadia, DAL, and the University of Calgary, and he holds an MBA from Queen's and Cornell. Melanie Popp, also on today's show, is a senior engineering advisor for geologic systems in Calgary. Up until 2015, her career focus was on completion optimization and hydraulic fracturing design in unconventional resources. She took a career pivot to leverage her desire for sustainable resource development by empowering companies to use data to drive business decisions. She has a degree in geological engineering from the University of Saskatchewan and a master's of petroleum engineering from the University of Calgary. And it is her birthday today, so happy birthday, Melanie. And finally, Jodi Anhorn, President and CEO of GLJ. Jodi has extensive experience, including reserves and resource evaluations, detailed field development studies, serving as project lead on multidisciplinary assets, and has advised executive teams and financial community on the preparation of domestic and international resource assessments and the appropriate securities disclosure rules. So a phenomenal team joining us here today. So welcome everybody to the show. It's great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So, like I said, first of all, happy birthday, Melanie. Great to see you. Thank you for making the time on the most important day.
Yes, yes.
So like I said at the beginning, we are talking about the Canadian energy transition and building on the current industry art and unconventionals and heavy oil, and we'll take a look at these emerging technologies and innovations. So a really, really exciting show. So to the audience, please, if you have questions about this for this expert panel, please ask us questions. Please comment in the chat, and we will pick up your questions and start addressing them as we go. But to kick us off, I'm going to ask David to give us a scene setting about, give us the big picture on current activities and large projects, particularly in shale, tight gas, and heavy oil.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks, Nils. I mean, Canada's pretty fascinating just in terms of what we cover from the energy spectrum in general, right? I mean, you look coast to coast, we have British Columbia all the way to Newfoundland, and you look, we've got major infrastructure projects like Site C from a hydro standpoint, all the way to Newfoundland with the Lower Churchill hydro as well. We've got offshore resources in Newfoundland, Labrador. When you come to Alberta, where we produce 80% of about the 5 million barrels a day of production that we have from Canada currently, which is a 20% decline since about the same time last year. We have a lot of activity in the Montney, in the Duvernay, from a shales, liquid-rich shales, tight gas standpoint. And then we've got large infrastructure projects associated with heavy oil development in the oil sands as well. So when I think about Canada and I think about the oil and gas environment in Canada, we kind of have the full meal deal, right? We've got onshore operations where we're hydraulically fracturing. We've got onshore operations where we're injecting steam. We're using shovels to extract hydrocarbons. And then we've got offshore stuff as well. We're looking at CCUS. We've got some really cool projects associated with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, with what's going on in Saskatchewan, where we've integrated kind of coal-fired power plants with some CCUS for EOR. I think Canada's really representative of the full meal deal for what's happening in energy and within oil and gas. So, Marty, I don't know if you have any commentary to kind of supplement that, but that's my view of Canada as a whole right now.
Yeah, that was pretty comprehensive. The only thing I might add, or just sort of supplement, is, on the heavy oil side, it's a big chunk of Canada's reserves, and it seems like we're always thinking about ways to access those resources. There's the conventional heavy oil between Alberta and Saskatchewan that we access by actually encouraging sand flow, which is kind of interesting. And then, of course, our massive oil sands reserves, which always require a lot of innovation to be able to make it work.
Thanks, Marty. Jodi, do you want to pick up a little bit? I mean, what's been in the news a lot relatively recently has been all the LNG in Canada. You got some sort of comments, scene setting around that you can give us?
Yeah, certainly. The LNG environment here in Canada has been really strong, and the push to begin, exporting significant volumes really happened many years ago, largely driven by the fact that Canada's largest trading partner, the elephant to the south of us in the U.S., became very, energy independent over the last 10 years. They've had a very substantial shale boom, so has Canada. The difference being that we had been primarily exporting our oil and natural gas to the United States, and really in the last 5 years that market has dried up. So we've had to begin to, search for proper export markets elsewhere, and that means getting our product to the tidewaters and largely to Asia off the west coast. So that's great in practice, and plans are being made, but of course there has been pushback on pipeline development, and so it's had to properly work its way through the system. A number of projects that were proposed have been shelved. There's really the large project which is underway right now, which is the LNG Canada being led through Shell and their partners, is underway and will happen in the next few years. But really, there are many that were proposed that have gone away, and then there's 2 or 3 others that are still in the plans. But it takes a long time, really, is what we're finding, and the development makes sense economically, but of course, there's lots of environmental, social, and Indigenous issues to deal with to physically make it happen. But LNG in BC makes a lot of sense. We're blessed with a ton of resources in northern British Columbia and northern Alberta, which are export ready. And British Columbia in general is very largely hydropowered. So a lot of the deliver, compress, and chill that will be done with extremely green energy. And let's face it, Canada's a little bit cold, so we're halfway there to the liquefied LNG process already. So it really does help us deliver pretty cost-effective product to the West Coast with short delivery times to Asia, for example.
Okay, thanks, Jodi. I mean, certainly adding to what Dave and Marty said there, so a very exciting time for Canada. You know, a lot of resources, a lot of activity. Pat, do you want to just pick up a little bit on some of the sort of more conventional techniques and technologies that might be around supporting this activity, you know, like EOR and stuff? You know, what's sort of happening at the moment around there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of the excitement with EOR in shales or unconventional started with EOG in the Eagle Ford. And there's been a lot of work that's been done to see what other basins that could be applicable in. I think in Canada, the main two would probably be the Montney and the Duvernay. But it's not a super simple question. You can't just do a cookie cutter approach to where EOR has worked and apply that in another basin. So I'm going to steal a little bit of what I've learned from some of the other guys who are real experts in shale EOR, like the guys from Whitson and particularly Matthias Carlson. But it seems like there's kind of 4 elements that you're looking for if you're looking for an EOR project that'll work in unconventionals, and that would be areas that are really, really rich gas condensate, which we have in the Montney and the Duvernay, or in the oil areas like volatile oil or black oil, which also exists there. You're looking for high reservoir pressures and frac radiants, which exist in areas of those reservoirs as well. Good containment. So if you're looking at a gas cycling EOR, then the gas that you're putting in, you can get a lot of that in there to recover additional liquids. And then last thing would be having lots of fracture surface area, which can work in the Montney and the Duvernay. I think it's one of the reasons why it was less successful when it's been tried in the Bakken. It seems like lots of the gas that you pump in for gas cycling would just go away to other areas of the reservoir. So I think there's a lot of potential for that in Canada. And there's some pilots going on, I know, in the Montney, but I think we'll see more of that in the future coming ahead as well.
Oh, yeah, great commentary there, Pat. So really sort of a bit of that knowledge transfer coming up from operations in the United States. And that sort of really kind of plays to this discussion we're going to have about innovations in the Canadian industry, and, you know, how that is advancing competitiveness for Canada, but also allows knowledge transfer from the Canadian business to other, you know, heavy oil and unconventional resource areas globally. I want to sort of just touch upon, if I may now, adapting to the low-cost environment. It's really impacted, you know, the U.S. operations, but specifically in Canada. Melanie, do you want to sort of pick up on that and talk to us a little bit about how the low-cost environment has been adopted and adapted within Canada?
Yeah, sure. I actually had a bit of a chuckle the other day when I saw an event called Adapting to the New Normal. And I was like, really? We've been talking about this in Canada since 2014, since the first oil price crash. And because what happened in most Canadian companies is that our friendly neighborhood capital, US, disappeared in that 2014, 2015 time. So we've had these last 5 years to really figure out how to do good oil for cheap. And, you know, and I think David's going to get into this next, do it sustainably with the ESGs and stuff as well. So I think that, you know, most of us have really learned how to not only do things cheaper, but do things better. And we'll talk a little bit more about those innovations, but it's been 5 years of really, you know, doing what we Canadians do best, which is buckling down and getting to work and getting creative about solutions.
Yeah, that is really great to hear. Particularly, I mean, that's a strong message also for, you know, it's echoed down here in the United States, you know, just adapting to those new realities. You mentioned there ESG, so environmental social governance. Dave, do you want to pick up on that? Tell us a little bit more about how that is being evolved and is a strength in Canadian operations.
Absolutely. So, I mean, first and foremost, when you think about just our regulatory process, when you look at the standards that Canadian oil and gas operators, just energy projects in general, are held to, our standards are really high. And sometimes that can be cumbersome in terms of getting projects off the ground, as many of the listeners and participants in this panel will acknowledge. But that's a huge benefit just from how we manage the environment in Canada. I think the other thing to acknowledge, and there's lots of people with lots of opinions on the price of carbon in Canada that are probably participating in this call or online, but having a price on carbon is a great signal just to show to the market that as Canadians who are participating in the upstream oil and gas industry, we acknowledge that climate change is real. There's a way that we're going to have to manage emissions, and by putting a price on carbon, having that kind of Pigovian tax really is the right way to deal with that. When you think about the social and the governance side of things, I also think that when you look at Canada and the way that our corporate structures are typically established, the level of engagement that we want to have with stakeholders, how we want to be good participants in the community, and the way that we generally conduct business, I think those are all positive things that Canadian companies do really well. And when you look at, if you had the choice of investing in an oil gas, if you could invest in Canada, where we have a lot of the benefits that I've just alluded to, why wouldn't you do that versus another jurisdiction? So I think a lot of the progressive views that we have in this space is just so positive for the Canadian oil and gas industry.
Yeah, I think you bring out a really strong positive there in terms of the investor community and sort of the attractiveness of the Canadian industry in terms of that ESG element that everybody is really starting to talk about. So just a quick throw out to the audience. So guys, if you have questions around this particular aspect of Canadian operations, the ESG elements, how they have adapted to the low cost environment and how that is a springboard for these additional innovations that we're about to talk about, then please make your comments and questions in the social media chat. Melanie, just picking up on what Dave said there around ESG, can you say a little bit about, what kind of technology innovations we're seeing, both from the federal government level, but also in terms of how we're adopting to new data analytics and that sort of thing to sort of drive the industry?
Yeah, so I'm going to bite off that data analytics piece because, as you alluded to in my intro, I was one of those people that did what I call a career pivot. So I started my career fracking Barnett shale wells in East Texas with Schlumberger in 2000. So there you go. It's my 42nd birthday today. Okay, people, I'm old, as my son reminded me. And, had this whole career doing hydraulic fracture optimization up until 2015 when I lost my job. And, the way that I had of making a living, which was that hydraulic fracture design optimization, was no longer needed in that space. So I really had to do some thinking about what I wanted to do differently. And I wasn't alone because, during around about 2015, I think there were some estimates that some 50% of geophysicists were out of work, some 33% of geologists, and 19% of petroleum engineers were out of work. So there was a lot of us that had to think differently about what we're doing. And so I dug into that space of data and data analytics. And Tuesday was my first Python class. And so I'm pretty happy and excited about that. But we've definitely seen that the professional themselves is really transforming. And, an example of that would be last February when we did have the local SPE here, SPE Canada, had the first subsurface data analytics, or one of the first, we're not quite sure, subsurface data analytics workshop. And it was hugely attended, like 250 people, which is a big event for Calgary, and it was sold out. So a lot of us that are looking to remain relevant in the space are upskilling in that technology space. And, the chatter around Calgary is how they want to be the next Canadian tech hub. And we think that we can do that by pivoting the skills that we already have honed in oil and gas also into other spaces. But one theme that you'll hear a lot of us talk about is this and conversation, right? Which is we can have oil and gas and we can have technology. And Niels, you alluded to the rational middle. They actually call it the radical middle, because it's actually an and conversation about we can have sustainable energy and we can have oil and gas. So I'm excited to hear the rest of the panel's thoughts on that.
Yeah, and Melanie, if I can just hop back in on there too to kind of build on like the ESG with collaborative or collaboration kind of data analytics piece. You think about the benefits that we have in terms of what's disclosed to or what's publicly accessible in terms of production data, and you think about what we're trying to do from managing methane emissions, what we're trying to do with the price of carbon, what we're doing in terms of abandonments and trying to get that under control in Canada too. To be able to have that big data context and have tons of engineering aptitude looking at that, I think that just shows how far down the curve that we can truly get in terms of production optimization when you think about the unconventional resource base that we have. Mm-hmm. So one of the talks that's coming out next week at our Unconventional Resources Conference, just to express kind of the level of detail that we can go in terms of chasing optimization for managing emissions and getting to that last knob to turn to improve production. There's a talk in one of the sessions that I'm dealing with where we have a person who's looking at how frac sand is dried, right? And how the logistics of frac sand gets to a site. So you just think about like what North American shales have been able to do since 2010 to supply in terms of their production contribution to oil. We're talking about like the very end of kind of that optimization wedge, right? Like we're looking at how we manage sand, how we truck it, how we rail it, how we treat it. I think this just shows what happens when we have such a competent technical base like we do in terms of the number of geoscientists and engineers that we have in Alberta, what we can solve and kind of chase when we apply those people in the right domains. And I think that speaks to what you've kind of mentioned, Melanie, with like, how do we build that and conversation? Mm-hmm. Oil and gas isn't going away tomorrow. We know that there's going to be a transition. How do we kind of set ourselves up for thinking about like, what's the right way to be collaborative and constructive as we progress into the energy transition?
So Dave, just to pick up some of the points there you were making, you mentioned production optimization, and again, it comes back to the ESG piece and particularly the environmental impact. So getting some really good questions and comments from the audience. I'm going to start with comments from Stuart Kinnear. Really, he's asking us, what's some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of unconventional production optimization, and picking up from that, also another question from him and other members is the transition on produced water. So, what's the low-hanging fruit, but produced water also, that comes back to logistics. So who wants to sort of address that one first?
I think maybe Marty and I can talk a little bit about the produced water. Before we get to that, getting back to kind of that point on the optimization curve. So the example that I just gave, this is the Unconventional Resources Conference in Canada. A lot of that paper is from a gentleman who works for PropX, and a lot of his work was actually done in the Permian. But look at how we're transitioning interbasin knowledge, right? We're taking learnings from the Permian, and we're kind of saying, okay, that sounds cool. How can we apply it to Canada, where maybe we have different weather patterns? Maybe we're a little bit colder, like Jodi had kind of mentioned. When we think about the water side of things, Marty, what I'm fascinated by kind of perpetually is when you look at shales, whether we're talking shales or tight sands, the amount of water that we manage and deal with from demand to actually pump fracs and stimulate our wells. I always find that interesting when we compare those kind of lenses on water versus the other unconventional resource, heavy oil, and how we manage water with tailings ponds and with steam. So I know on the fracking side of things, we track water pretty diligently. There's a big push to kind of reduce freshwater utilization, and there's a big push as well to recycle as much as our produced and flowback water as possible. Again, speaking to that ESG lens and kind of how we manage things from a regulatory standpoint as well. So I'm always interested in that carryover from like tight stuff to unconventional heavy viscous stuff.
Yeah,
maybe Dave, before Marty gets into the heavy stuff, I can just touch on quickly on the unconventional side for recycling. I think a lot of that depends on how far into a play you are. Like if you're in at a really early stage and you're just drilling appraisal wells and trying to understand what's happening in a play, then it's a little bit more difficult to have really robust infrastructure to have good reuse of water resources. But as you get further along, lots of companies are investing lots of money to have the right water infrastructure to not need much fresh water. For example, at Petronas, I think we reuse roughly 90% of the water in our fracturing operations. So there's fairly extensive infrastructure that we have to minimize the amount of fresh water that needs to be used. So with that, maybe Marty can take over with some of the heavy oil side as well.
Yeah, I can just make some brief comments. Recycling is obviously super important, and we have the advantage that we have fixed facilities and large, long-term facilities, so we can build infrastructure to do extensive recycling for water. It's kind of it made me think. It's interesting that we have these, I guess, virtually co-located conferences next week. Maybe there is crossover between what we're doing with water and applicability to the tight plays. That's just an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about even looking at those kinds of possibilities.
Thanks, Marty. So, Jodi, I just want to turn to you just for a moment. So, GLJ, you've been looking at sort of the ESG piece quite a lot, I understand, recently. Any comments you want to sort of add to what Marty and Dave were saying?
Yeah, excellent comments, and I completely agree. I personally, I work a little bit more in the unconventional space than the heavy oils, although we have a large heavy oil group here. And really, what Patrick is commenting on about getting over 90% of their water reused each and every job is a huge accomplishment, right? And they're making strides every day to reduce the need for fresh water up there, and those are big advancements that are happening. And others just on logistics and the volume of sand that gets moved around is mind-boggling. So there's a lot of work being done there, and a lot of it really is geared all coming from ESG. And to me, if you get your G right, if you've got good governance, you tend to have good environmental records, you tend to have good sustainability records that go along with it. And yeah, we've been helping companies and our clients try to represent the work that they do in ESG properly. It obviously allows the public at large to see what companies are doing in that space, and I think Canada really needs to wave our flag a little bit harder in terms of what we've done in that space. Sometimes working in this industry, it feels like you got a target on your back, and part of it is just because we are fairly open and transparent with what we're doing. And some people have said that makes you a bit of a soft target, but I also do think it means that the progress that's being made has to be talked about a little bit, and the successes talked about as well. And then you tend to get a little bit more of the public fever in behind you, supporting what's being done and seeing the progress that's being made, because it is critical. There's no question about it. And I think the idea of this being the radical middle, I guess, is really good, because all ships tend to turn, but they take a while. So if we've been moving in one direction, really strong push towards restrictions, I would say. I think people are starting to see that there has to be a balance. It's not green energy or fossil fuels. It really needs to be a balance. And what we will find, I think, over time is that where that balance goes to depends a lot just on where you are in the world. There are areas of the world that can be very, hydropowered and electrical generation from that, and there's others that aren't blessed with that, and they'll have to be looking at other ideas and concepts, which I know we'll get into a little bit longer. But Canada's done a really good job with that, and I think the movement on the ESG and the transparency will help in the public domain.
Oh, thank you, Jodi. Really, really powerful messages there in terms of the transparency importance, or the importance of transparency in ESG and bringing the public on side, at least in terms of information. And you're talking there about the energy spectrum and being able to sort of have a mix of energies. I just want to come back to you, Melanie, to really sort of pick up on the transparency piece and sort of the public governance, if you want, of oil and gas and the energy industry. Talk to us a little bit about the Canadian culture, because I mean, it's really a cornerstone to much of what's happening in Canada.
Yeah, just to pick up what Jodi was saying. So I'm often shocked when I go to conferences and I hear a lot of people that are presenting papers saying like, this would be better if we had more data, if we had more data. And here in Canada, we as the citizens are regarded as the resource owners. And so a lot of data, as David alluded to, the production data, but everything from land information to drilling to completions to the production to fluid testing, like all of that is made public. And that's exactly what my company does, is takes that data and puts it into a, like I say, we take a cow and we turn it into a steak, so you can take it and do whatever you want to with it. But I think that by making all of that data available, it really creates more of a culture of collaboration as opposed to competition. Because if I know that I'm going to be able to read your frac report in 3 months from now, I don't really care about competing with you that much. And also what we have in Calgary, I say pre-COVID, although it's starting to come back a little bit, our COVID cases are under control and some offices have started to open up, is a very small central downtown that pretty much every major oil and gas company has headquarters in. So it's, 12 blocks by 12 blocks. If you want to get an answer or talk about something, you are never more, like I say, never more than a Tim Hortons coffee or a beer away from getting your answer. So, even all of us that are on the panel here today coming together to plan this conference, some of us, David and I did our masters together, right? So it's like we've got this history already. And so what I really enjoy about the culture is that we have an oil and gas culture. It's, we're all wanting to come together in order to do good by the resource owners, which are also us as well. So that's what's different about Canada.
Oh, thanks, Melanie. So just to really pick up on that, Marty, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the innovations around how to get stuff out of the ground? So I'm thinking, COSIA and other sort of operator groups where sort of that encourages collaboration to sort of drive innovation and operational efficiency.
Yeah, COSIA is a great example of the culture here. It entails it's an organization of almost all the oil sands operators, if not all of them. And there's a focus on sharing technologies and also co-developing technologies and trying to study the problems that are common to all of us. There's a recognition that if we can solve a problem, it benefits all of us, and it's not so much competitive amongst ourselves as it is competitive between us and I guess the challenges that we're facing, the technical challenges. So COSIA focuses a lot on improving the environmental performance of our oil sands extraction. We have, it's common to have joint industry projects focusing on technologies. I've been personally involved in flow control device joint industry projects where it's just enjoyable to be able to work with people from other companies and be quite open about the data that we're looking at and the problems that we're focusing on and co-developing things with people across the downtown block.
Oh, thanks, Marty. So Pat, Dave, what's your experience in terms of the operator groups, on the unconventional space?
Yeah, Dave, I'll throw in a few thoughts and you can go next. But I've been a part of a few different ones. Like when I was working in the Duvernay, been involved with the Fox Creek Operators Group, which is like a Duvernay operators group that's in the Fox Creek area. Involves a lot of sharing of best practices. It's kind of like a forum for operators to talk about what works, what doesn't work, how can we improve environmental performance or production. And other ones like IHS community of best practice for Duvernay. That was a pretty interesting one where in the early days of the Duvernay, there were a lot of questions about how the reservoir works and what's happening because there's some strange things going on. So it was kind of like a data sharing pool from a bunch of different operators facilitated by IHS where they're trying to solve kind of targeted problems that would come from the operators group, and then it was also a forum for sharing learning. So there's a lot of things like that going on. Montney Producers Group is another one. Dave could probably add a few more things, but they're really valuable, and it's a great place to network with other colleagues so that you can have those follow-up coffees later, like Melanie was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think just building on what Melanie said, what Patrick said, so we've got these joint industry projects that we can work on. We've got this kind of network vein in Calgary that you can go and talk with people, have a coffee and share things. The other aspect is for projects that we do have some provincial or federal funding and support for, when you look at like the Quest project, when you look at the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, like Melanie had said, because taxpayers are involved in some of the investment there, these reports are also available online, and you can go and look at a Quest report or an Alberta Carbon Trunk Line report on the Government of Alberta's website. And I think that gives a lot of kind of feedstock or kind of enabling kind of benefit to other people that want, or other groups that want to pursue similar types of investments. So, speaking again in that same type of vein to the question that Carlos has, when you look at CCUS technology, right there we've got some of the benefits of the current projects that we have going on that are in the public domain. The other cool thing that we have, if you think about Sask Power and what's going on with Weyburn, there's actually a CCS knowledge center at the University of Regina that's kind of specifically linked to that project. And in early 2021, we're currently in the process of framing up a Canadian-focused CCUS event on behalf of the SPE that we're trying to dovetail with some different jurisdictional context, right? Like, we're looking at this from a Canadian lens where maybe we have how does CCUS link from shales, power to dealing with the utilization and storage side of things. Some of the other groups that we're dealing with, we've got our North Sea kind of segment where they're looking at what can we do offshore. We've got a potential opportunity where, Australia really seems like it's perhaps the LNG epicenter of the world right now. Can we find a link between LNG and CCUS there? So one of the benefits that I think in Canada in general is we're so collaborative, right? I look at the example that I provided in terms of back and forth between Canada and the Permian. Look, we're trying to tag into other jurisdictions to see where we can kind of grow the pie. So I think that's just a big subculture vein in Canada is collaboration.
Oh, thanks. I think that's a really powerful message there. And I think that, as you say, that really sets Canada apart, that collaboration and transparency culture that underpins a lot of the oil and gas operations. I'm thinking, Dave, as you just said, difference between Canada and, for example, the Permian and the Texas. We have in Texas, we have data transparency, but we don't necessarily have the collaborative environment that you have there in Canada. So maybe a question that some of the audience may be thinking about is, well, if you're not competing in terms of, because you have so much open data resources, then I guess the competition comes between operating companies comes down to technology, innovation, and operational efficiency, which is sort of another way of driving the business. So I think we're just going to need to pivot a little bit on the conversation to look ahead and start talking about some of the innovations that are coming up. You've already mentioned it, Pat, Dave, Melanie, and also Marty, and we've got questions coming in from the audience. Carlos was talking a moment ago, was asking, how is Canada doing in terms of exploring CCUS technology? What are the barriers perceived in oil and gas in terms of taking up that technology? So maybe let's start with that question, then we can go on to Takir's question later on about produced water. But what are some of the barriers? Let's talk about the innovation and the barriers to, say, CCUS. What's happening up in Canada around that?
Yeah, so a couple of quick ones just to start, and happy for anybody else on the panel to hop in on here. I think not putting all our eggs in one basket is a big takeaway, right? CCUS, when you look at some of those technologies, they can be relatively expensive. So just the other day on the Arc Energy Ideas podcast, which is a great podcast in Canada, specifically within Calgary to listen to get kind of the lay of the land for the Canadian energy industry, they had a a senior member from Shell talking about our nature-based solutions opportunities. So, you've got CCUS, you've got nature-based solutions. If you think about Permania and 45Q that exists within the states for the EUR benefit associated with CO2, can we come up with perhaps like north of the 49Q, right, for what we're going to do to get some EUR incentives in place to both perhaps improve our production for oil while putting away some of that carbon. So again, speaking to that, you've got some cool technologies in Canada coming out with carbon engineering, where you've got this direct air capture technology. Is there a way that we could even grow the pie where you look at like some of these hydro projects, whether in BC or in Newfoundland and Labrador, and you say, hey, if we're surfeit with power, could we spin some of that power into this direct air capture technology? Maybe that technology is expensive on a per ton utilization basis, but what else are you going to do with that power? Is that an opportunity where we could do something kind of creative and kind of make those links between oil and gas and some of the other elements of the energy spectrum, right?
Dave, I think there are some of the barriers are being overcome now, though, and maybe Jodi would want to touch on this a bit more, but things like having the infrastructure to actually collect carbon dioxide from some of the industrial heartland, like north of Edmonton, and then transport it via a major pipeline to areas where it could be used for EUR, like with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. Jodi, I don't know, do you want to build on that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in with that. You're exactly right. That's in Canada we do have several world-class, world-scale CCS and CCUS projects, and the one you just mentioned is a recent one here in Alberta where we do have capture of CO2 in north near Edmonton in the industrial heartland. Some of it's from a refinery, some of it's from fertilizer plant, which would have previously, been cleaned up and then somewhat vented, and now it's being captured and used in a trunk line format. So it's made accessible to a number of operators through Alberta, via licensing and payment model to really access large-scale EOR projects that really, had run the gamut of primary depletion and waterflood depletion, great reservoirs, large reservoirs with 40-50% recovery, but now we can get another 10 or 20 or more percent recovery out of it using the CO2. So not only are we, capturing and storing it permanently, but we're actually getting a real benefit from it, which is fantastic. And there's others. Obviously, there have been some large-scale ones in South Saskatchewan for quite a while. Think of the Weyburn, the Mydale fields, and Saskatchewan also has large just CCS projects where they'll capture, offshoot CO2 and byproducts and just simply store them, not necessarily using them in EOR projects. But David's right. I mean, the cost is high on these projects, and so they're not a plethora of them simply because the barrier to do them is harder. But that's really where technology and innovation will drive it. As we have the ability to do smaller scale projects, we'll have the ability to use smaller scale volumes. If we can see the future, I think, a little bit with smaller, steam reformed projects where we'll have the ability to, reform, create hydrogen and CO2 on a smaller scale, obviously use the hydrogen for whatever the local need is, energy or transportation, and then use the CO2 for local EOR projects. And that really will bring the barrier down in terms of who has the money and the projects to use them.
And, just one other aspect, kind of hopping on with what Jodi's saying, right? Jodi's coming from, he's got all this experience in the reserves domain. That's one of the aspects that I think is fascinating when we talk about the energy transition, right? Like, hey, we're going to talk about CO2, cost matters. How do investors know that this project is going to make sense? So where's that kind of reserves type approach that we can talk about with like CO2 projects and with renewables projects? So a reservoir engineer is not necessarily going to hop on to a renewables project tomorrow. There's going to be a transition there, but some of these considerations, I think we have a lot of kind of domain knowledge to parlay that kind of economic view into other parts of the energy spectrum, right?
Yeah, and just real quick one on that one. So the Petroleum Technology Research Council out of the University of Regina is actually producing a map that is EOR potential reservoirs, right? So coming at it from the reservoir perspective. It's a white paper. It's coming out soonish. I just talked to the guys the other day. We partner with them on some of their research. So lots of exciting things happening there.
That's really fascinating to hear this conversation. Particularly, I like the fact that it's anchored in the infrastructure, so that you have this carbon trunk line that is going to be able to help distribute the captured carbon, and so that it can actually have a useful application like in EOR. So I think that's one of the sort of the gaps that we have in many other locations, particularly in the Permian, where we don't have that infrastructure in place. And I was wondering, it sort of speaks to the ESG comments you guys made earlier, but carbon is very much a sexy headline-grabbing thing. I'm thinking of going back to the question earlier from Takir Javid about water, and water is such a big byproduct of what we do in unconventionals and heavy oil. Also needs infrastructure, also an important part of ESG. So comments around that, what can we do better or more of with sort of water infrastructure?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think kind of that lens of petroleum engineering, right? Like, absolutely want to meet the regulatory standards and what makes sense there. We also have that kind of cost lens that Pat had alluded to, right? So early on in projects, sometimes that's more difficult to manage. But hey, if we know that an issue is important, then as we frame up that project and we mature that development, we're going to help figure out what makes sense from an infrastructure investment to manage that, so that we're kind of not using more than what we need, and managing that waste stream. And I mean, that's kind of that triple bottom line, right? Like, that makes sense from a dollars and cents standpoint, but that also makes sense from a stakeholder standpoint and an environment standpoint. So,
and I'll just talk a little bit about water too, because the other question that came in here was about, like, what is the big strategic shift that we want to see in hydraulic fracturing operations? So one of the things that my company does is we curate a frac database. So I mentioned that we have all these completion reports that are available publicly. We have a team of 11 engineers that are going in and looking at those fracs stage by stage. And the one thing that I notice is that most often, every frac in that well is the same, regardless of how much that well changes over the several hundred meters of length. And so where I see, putting back my old frac engineer hat on, is it would be great if we could actually custom engineer those completions to be suitable for the rock in that, 50 to 100 meter, whatever your stage spacing is, range. And I think that's where water optimization comes in as well, which is not over fracking things and not under fracking them either. So kind of just tying in those two concepts of water conservation and also, step changes in hydraulic fracturing.
Yeah, I'd add to that, Melanie, on the optimization side. I know I've looked a lot at projects. How can you optimize your completion design for how the reservoir changes along the lateral? But it's always really difficult. And I think another way to look at it is, how do you optimize in real time based on data that you're gathering? So I'll put a plug in for a paper that I really liked by Kyle Housefight from Devon. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's about a technique called sealed wellbore pressure monitoring. And it was one of the more exciting things that I've seen recently for how you can try and monitor your frac geometry growth real time as you're completing, and then make on-the-fly changes for if you think you're overstimulating or understimulating. So I think there's a lot of potential there for something that's cheap that could give you really good information.
Yeah, I think there's one other piece with water, and that's when you look at the products of combustion, water is one of those products of combustion, right? So when you do a material balance on like how much water you inject into a well from a stimulation standpoint versus, the water of combustion that's yield from, utilizing our hydrocarbons, that water balance is actually quite surprising. So sometimes we actually are net producers or adders of water to the water cycle. That might not seem intuitive, but that math kind of supports that. So just a different lens, right? That's not talked about that often.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And water is often forgotten because it is such it almost has no cost as a byproduct, right? So we don't necessarily take enough care of it. But it's in a way a separate conversation. I just want to turn us back to some of the other exciting stuff that you have got going in Canada. So let's talk a little bit about the geothermal and the hydrogen piece. Those are kind of innovations that are beginning to appear. Jodi, do you want to sort of pick up a little bit on the geothermal developments?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So a lot of this obviously is being driven by the big trends that we've introduced here, right? As there's a continual push for improvement, and we've got a large, skilled, highly educated workforce here that's not being fully utilized in energy. And so, the creative minds are coming up with creative solutions to problems. And so one of them obviously is in geothermal space. Again, we've had geothermal, worldwide for years. So why hasn't it taken off? It's largely because it's been geolocated, right? The areas where it's easy, where you have the ability to get, high temperatures at shallow depths, places like Iceland and some areas of the United States, they have been successfully operating geothermally. But for most of the world, that's not the case, right? You have to get deeper to get the temperatures that are required. And so, one example that we talked about in the build up to this discussion was a local company called Ever Technologies, which has, a sort of an unconventional geothermal bent, and they've taken a lot of the skills that local community and energy has, drilling, facilities, etc., and they've built. A simple way to think about it is a bit of a underground radiator. They'll drill deep, several kilometers down with horizontal wells that they connect in the subsurface, and they create a closed loop system. So they're not actually putting fluids into the formation and recovering them for temperature. They're simply utilizing cooler fluids along the wellbore, which get naturally heated at that depth. And then they bring up hot fluids at the surface, and they utilize that either for heating or electrical generation. And it's scalable. It's early days, I'd say, for them. They piloted and they've successfully bringing this to market, sort of as we speak. But there's a great example of, ingenuity and use of skills that really are well developed in Canada.
Yeah, great comment there. Maybe even a sort of small, they can even use some of the produced water on a small scale, in those.
And in some cases, utilizing older wellbores that weren't being utilized anyway. So it's a way to repurpose them, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's super exciting. The geothermal side, to me, that's one of the areas where there's so many parallels between unconventional oil and gas development and geothermal. And to me, where Ed was at is really cool with having this underground heat loop. But in a way, it feels like it's kind of where we were in 2010, say, with unconventional development, where everybody was at that time looking more at like multilaterals and that sort of thing. But to get more heat transfer, one of the main things that you would need is surface area. And so we have thousands of hydraulically fractured wells that have incredible amounts of surface area contacting this warm rock. I think there's huge potential there to both use the skill sets that we have and use some of these wells that otherwise might become abandonment liabilities and could become a really valuable resource. So I think there's lots of potential there.
Yeah, in geothermal, they don't call it fracturing, though. They call it geoshearing because of the bad implications that fracturing has gotten in the media. So that was my push. I said, now we need to rename hydraulic fracturing because nothing helps more than a big rebrand.
Yeah, but that's certainly a very exciting sort of technology transfer, and be able to, as you say, utilize that fracturing, or if you want to use the new term, shearing of the rock to increase the surface area and help improve the energy transfer. That to me, that's very exciting, and it's an encouraging way for our industry to progress and expand into new areas. And talking about that, let's mention hydrogen for a little bit as well. So, I mean, that's grabbing a lot of headlines now in terms of an alternative utilization of hydrocarbons. Pat, do you want to take us through a little bit on the hydrogen?
Yeah, I could mention a couple things that I've seen, and I think Marty maybe has something on the oil sands side to that as well. But I've seen a lot more technology in the news coming out and ways that hydrogen can be used. And what excites me a lot of the time is when there's synergies or technologies that complement each other. So one that was kind of neat that I've seen was some technologies that would convert methane into hydrogen and value-added products that are not CO2. And then you could be using that hydrogen with the existing infrastructure that you have for pipelines. For example, like ATCO recently announced a project where they're going to be blending up to, I think, about 5% hydrogen into the residential gas distribution network in Fort Saskatchewan, near Edmonton. So it could be that natural gas ends up adding on different value-added products that can not produce CO2 and can help with cleaner energy production.
Thanks. Marty, do you want to pick up a bit on that?
I can't comment on specific technologies or anything in particular. It just makes me think back, though, when I was in school a very long time ago. One of my professors said, you know, it's so primitive that we're still burning hydrocarbons. It's a great energy source. It's high energy density. Would be fantastic if we could find out and figure out a way to get the energy out without burning it. So just makes me think of that. It's just interesting.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like the next step, you know, it's sort of having, if we can split the hydrocarbon somewhere very close to its source, then, you know, hopefully you can dispose of the carbon problem more easily. So who knows what the future holds around that. Melanie, let's go back to you just at the end here. You're a Saskatchewan girl. So talk to us about Saskatchewan. What's exciting about Saskatchewan?
Well, it used to be the best thing we could say about Saskatchewan was easy to draw, hard to spell. And props to you for saying it properly, because it's definitely a mouthful. But like when I was growing up as a farm kid in Saskatchewan, you talk about water and the use in oil and gas. I always give my farm family a hard time about how much water they're using to produce food, which is a lot more than what we're doing. But when I was growing up, you know, wheat was the #1 export from Saskatchewan. And the one thing that we often forget is that geology doesn't know borders. So the Bakken assets that are in North Dakota are also in the southern part of Saskatchewan. And they've used those assets in Saskatchewan to grow their oil and gas production. And in fact, they're doubling down on oil and gas production. And the goal is that they're going to be increasing 30% by 2030 to a total of 600,000 barrels a day. But going back to this whole concept of an and conversation is that they're, yes, in increasing oil and gas production, and they're also, you know, we touched on hydrogen. So there's this company called Proton Technologies. Again, I'm going to echo Dave's comments and do if you haven't listened to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast, please do. He's the one that turned me on to it. It's great. A couple months ago, they actually had the founder of Proton there, and we're talking about some of their in situ hydrogen production project that they're doing in Saskatchewan right now. They also are going to be opening up a helium purification facility in about a year from now, in July 2021, around the Swift Current area. So they've drilled about 15 wells. And then there's also a lithium project. And that's another thing that's kind of exciting. You talk about water, but there's actually resources that we can pull from that water, like lithium. Like I said, my company deals in oil and gas data, and we just signed our first lithium customer the other day. So there's people that are interested in this data to do different things with it, like the hydrogen, the helium, the lithium, and then also the geothermal. So there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. And, you know, really kudos to all of you guys. I mean, to me, talking to you today, just the excitement and energy that you all have and this sort of very collaborative nature, I think, you know, it's sort of building on that whole resilient Canadian industry. It's sort of that's what sets you apart, right? As sort of Canadian and sort of Canadian industry. So I think that's hugely encouraging. And we got kudos also from the audience. So John Jean, he was saying, if the entire industry spoke as confidently and competently about ESG as this panel has, the external confidence in the industry would be transformed. So very impressive. So kudos to all of you. So thank you. Just to round us off, I want to pick up on an earlier comment from Pablo Silva. He's sort of asking, before he left the industry to start a PhD, he was talking about the addressing the generation gap and the crew change. So, you know, again, it comes back to this collaborative culture that the Canadians have. Looking ahead, what are your concerns around the upcoming petroleum engineers and the big crew change? Do you want to sort of start with you, Melanie, and then just work around the table a little?
First of all, thank you for the comments about, you know, our expertise in this area. But I think that what most of us have found is that we need to be a more well-rounded, not only professional, but a citizen. And in order to speak on behalf of the industry that we work in, we have to know all of the different aspects of it, right? I am deeply concerned about the next generation of petroleum engineers. Here in Canada, I chair the SPE Canadian Education Foundation, and we sponsor scholarships and energy literacy programs for Canada. And the whole point is really to create and have a more united conversation, right? And so one thing that I've noticed, we talk about the Canadian culture, is that we do, in our day-to-day interactions, have a more holistic view on what our role is in the entire economy and in our country as a whole. But I really think that we do need to have a more united, that's the one thing I have to say about Canada, is that we're not really united in where we stand with what our energy strategy is. And that's what I really hope that we can get behind, so we can continue to attract the talent that we need in order to keep this industry growing sustainably.
Oh, thank you. Pat, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I'm concerned as well, like Melanie is. It just seems like there's less interest going into petroleum engineering for a university education choice. However, what I would say is, I know for me, I didn't come from petroleum engineering. My background was mechanical engineering. I had thought, I don't know, it'd be cool to go work with cars or something. And really, I think the engineering education teaches you how to go about solving problems. So maybe we'll need to start pulling from different skill sets, like with this and conversation, if there's going to be other energy systems that need to be blended together with oil and gas development. You might not be pulling from petroleum engineers. It could be pulling from other disciplines that are traditionally considered outside of the oil and gas industry, and everything just becomes a bit more blended together in terms of talent pool.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful message, building on from Melanie there, in terms of drawing from wider talent pool. Dave, what's your views on the crew change?
Yeah, so I'd hop on board with Melanie and Pat. I mean, I'm a millennial, definitely concerned about the next generation of petroleum engineers, the next generation of engineers that are going to be participating in the energy industry, but I'm confident, right? So the cool thing that I think we can kind of segue here is that collaborative aspect that we've been talking about within our industry. How do we start to do that when we talk about net zero and different scopes of emissions, right? Are those emissions directly attributable to you and your company, or you as a consumer and your behavior? The more that we kind of develop that energy literacy lens, we start to recognize that nothing's really perfect. There's always costs and benefits and trade-offs with whatever choice that we make. So how do we really kind of delve into that more constructive conversation to acknowledge some of those puts and takes and collaborate even outside of the energy industry, right? Like that nutrient example, would you really think of a fertilizer producer as a typical participant in a carbon sequestration utilization project? Maybe not. So how do we keep doing that and reaching outside of our industry to collaborate and kind of grow the pie?
Oh, fantastic. Constructive conversation and trade-offs. Yeah, having to find that balance. Absolutely. Marty, what's your view?
Yeah, I'd echo what everybody else has said, and what David said there, especially, nothing's free. And I personally, maybe it's because I'm listening for it, but I feel like I've heard that the public conversation is starting to understand that or shift towards that. So what we see in front of us are big problems. And so it requires big effort, big solution, and we're motivated to do that. So when you bring in young engineers, engineers are problem solvers. So how to make your world better? Well, what better way to look at providing energy for people and figure out the best way to do that? I'm hopeful that message is coming through. And on the other end, when I think about eventually retiring, and when I see some of my colleagues retiring, a lot of it's not a crew change. It's a reduced participation. So hopefully some of that knowledge from people who have earned it can keep that knowledge in our industry in years going forward.
I really like what you said there, particularly for sort of old people like myself, reduced participation rather than just saying, hey, here's your paycheck, off you go. So thank you. But big problems, big effort to make a better world. Absolutely. That's a very resounding message to everybody. Jodi, I know you're passionate about training and education. What are your final thoughts around this?
Yeah, well, the good part about going last is I get to hear all the excellent comments, and I agree wholeheartedly. So the bit I'm going to pick up on and profess is that really in Canada we do graduate some pretty fantastic engineers, and whether that's mechanical, chemical, petroleum, energy, you name it, and they are fantastic problem solvers. I think Marty hit the nail on the head with that one. And we hire a number and we train a lot, and it's incredible the skills that they do come out with, and really how transferable that knowledge can be. They've demonstrated the ability to learn and apply, technical concepts in real practical ways. And so honestly, I feel great for them, to be perfectly honest with you. I wish that more graduates going into school would see that. Don't just look at, the press that says, oil is dead or what have you, and really just look at the abilities that learning any of those engineering schools will teach you, because it's going to be an in-demand requirement over the next 50 years again, whether it is petroleum or whether it is geothermal or hydrogen or lithium. All those skills are learned in engineering schools. In Western Canada, that's obviously where I'm familiar with. And I think it's a fantastic springboard into any and all of those, because you could, turn on a dime and repurpose, as Melanie did, from, a completions frac engineer to, data science. And so those skills are all being taught at the schools. And I think people have to see that, right? There obviously are cycles in the industry, but a career isn't a cycle, and you have to, just stay fresh with your technologies and be able to pivot when required.
Oh, thank you, Jodi. Guys, we're out of time, but a fantastic conversation. Just talking to you, listening to you guys today makes me really optimistic and hopeful about the future, and particularly for how Canada is one of these regions just leading the way in terms of its collaborative culture and technology development and innovation. A last shout out to Paras Gorpani, saying extremely grateful for the valuable and informative session by the panelists. So kudos again to you guys. I mean, it's just this Canadian culture that you have that brings out this optimism and highlights the benefits of our industry. So Melanie, Pat, Marty, Dave, Jodi, thank you very much for participating today. And Melanie, happy birthday again.
Yeah, I know. Dave mentioned pie like 4 times, which reminds me I'm going to go and get the pie for my birthday after this.
Happy birthday, Melanie. Thanks, guys.
Pie and the chimneys.
Thanks, audience. Thank you, Asha, for all the production. And once again, SPE Foundation for sponsoring this. So thank you, guys, and have a great day, great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.